Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar about building a scalable data culture at Wayfair. My name is Heidi Jen, and I'm a customer success manager at Looker and Google Cloud. I'm going to be your host and moderator today. On today's webinar, I am thrilled to introduce my lovely customer and neighbor, Rongjie Lu, Analytics Product Manager at Wayfair. She'll be sharing tips and tricks around implementing and scaling Looker adoption. We're just about to start, but I want to go over a few housekeeping items. So we're going to have a 15-minute Q&A session at the end of our presentation. Feel free to ask questions during as well. We're going to be trying our best to get all of your questions answered. I would definitely type your questions into the Q&A box and click send. We're also going to be recording the presentation, so expect a copy at the very end as well. And finally, the windows on your screen are fully customizable, so you can minimize them, maximize them, close them. If you accidentally close a window, though, and want to get it back, just click the toolbar menu at the very bottom of your screen. I think that's it. So with that, I'd love to pass it over to Rongjie.
Cool beans. Thanks, Heidi. Yeah, my name is Rongjie, and I am a product manager at Wayfair. I own Looker as a product here at Wayfair, and today I am going to talk about how we really use Looker here at Wayfair. And I have an agenda here. First, I'm going to go through some historical context. Then we'll talk about a little bit of the strategy that we have for Looker here at Wayfair. And then we'll talk about how we actually implemented and grew Looker. And then lastly, where are we now currently with the tool? So starting off, for those of you who are not as familiar with Wayfair, we are an online furniture retail company, but while that's mainly what we do, we also like to think of ourselves as a technology company. So with that, then 90% of our overall corporate users use some sort of BI tool, and we used to use a lot of different BI tools. Now at Wayfair, we don't really have one centralized BI team. We have a federated BI model. So we have individual BI functions embedded within engineer teams that support a specific business line. So for example, we might have a marketing specific BI team or a merchandising specific BI team instead of one. But with that, though, we do have one infrastructure team that supports infrastructure and platform needs of all of these individual BI teams. And my team, the data tools team, which is a product team, fits under that larger infrastructure team. So with that, then, how we really got started as a team is Wayfair had a lot of different BI tools, and it was really difficult providing the support and infrastructure needed for all of these different tools because of how different these priorities might be for each of the individual areas. And because all of these different areas are using these tools differently as well and have different data maturity that we had to consider as well. So my team as a data tools team had some overall goals that we needed to accomplish. One was to limit the number of tools being used at Wayfair to focus more on supporting one or two major tools at Wayfair. And then with that, then we had to choose the right tool for our use cases. And having a lot of use cases and a lot of different data maturity, we had to basically align those with all the tools that we were considering as well. Two is with whatever tools that we chose, we had to make sure that it was scalable to the degree that Looker was going to, that Wayfair was going to grow as well. Because we grow really fast from both a human and data capacity, it was important to make sure that we have the correct infrastructure and platform to support this too. So that goes into the resource availability portion. With those considerations, then we came up with a strategy. So how does Looker fit into our strategy then? Looker actually started out as a pilot project for one specific team here at Wayfair. And with this pilot, they satisfied a lot of their use cases on that team. And it was really something that our leadership on that team liked a lot too and really liked talking about. Akil, the director on that team, really loved the product and was able to talk to a lot of different other teams too about how they are successful using the product, how they are finding innovative ways to answer their questions with this product. And they were talking about how it would be great if we can expand Looker to the rest of the company. with those talks, we decided to see how Looker would fit in if we were to choose it as a tool to expand upon. And Looker did fit a lot of our different use cases and is able to address a lot of our concerns with different levels of data maturity as well. So we decided that, yes, it makes sense for us to expand on Looker and grow Looker here at Wayfair as a tool. There were also a lot of other moving pieces happening at Wayfair during that time that also led us in the direction of wanting Looker as one of our tools as well. Some of the infrastructure changes and that we were beginning to use GBQ at the time influenced that. We also had some infrastructure goals that we wanted to accomplish on the data governance side, as well as on how we wanted to provide more microservices and platform tools. So Looker did fit those goals as well, which made it a really good fit for us. With that, then we decided that.
Oops, yeah. Sorry, not to interrupt you, but we did get a question. And so I'm just going to read that to you. But it's cool. Before you selected Looker as a visualization tool, were you already a GCP user? And if so, how much did that play into your decision to select Looker over alternatives?
Yeah, so when we selected Looker, we were actually not on GCP at that point in time, but we knew GCP was something coming up that we are prioritizing and starting to move more people to. So that didn't necessarily influence our decision in wanting to expand Looker initially and try out more to see if it made more sense to grow into other teams, but it did significantly speed up our growth process. So hopefully that answers your question. But yeah, so after we determined that Looker is a good fit, we wanted to decide what are the strategies that we're going to implement with Looker. So for us, with our needs and the different areas that we want to focus on, it really made sense for us to use a hub and spoke model, because the hub and spoke model provided us with a lot of data governance, and it also brought alignment with some of our engineering goals, and it gave us flexibility on how we built and the timeline that we built in. Another thing we determined with our strategy was we wanted to use a proof of concept or POC build methodology, in that any project, when it starts in Looker, it starts in our POC environment. And that's kind of like a testing phase for that group to see if Looker really makes sense for them, if they needed to test a new technology, because at that time, both Looker and GCP were new technologies, and to make sure that whatever they're building match their stakeholders' expectations and can be used once we decide to productionize it. So once we determined that these two strategies makes the most sense for our needs, we decided to bring it up to BI leadership and get their buy-in. Because no matter what direction we want to go into, we had to align with these leaders to make sure that we can prioritize appropriately and talk to the stakeholders and let them know why we made these decisions. And getting leadership buy-in, some of the things that we focused on was, here are the problem areas that we're facing, and here is what matched back to things that you've seen, and this is how the tool can help with that. How this overall strategy can help you as well as our teams to create the data community that we want, as well as here are some of the successful areas that have already used Looker and how they like Looker and what are some of the challenges that they face as well. Once we got leadership buy-in, it was really time to decide how do we start this implementation process then. With that, what we did was we talked to a lot of different teams and selected some initial POCs. Because we don't have one centralized BI team, that means it didn't make sense for one centralized BI team to build the hub of our hub and spoke model. And to go back a little bit, the hub and spoke model is this concept of the hub having centralized data sources that everyone probably uses at some point in time. So finance is a really good one to think about when thinking about the hub. Another thing for us is clickstream. Like everyone might want to see what our customers are clicking, for example. So for those things, we put in the hub. The spokes are going to be more data areas are being used by your individual business teams that are more focused on a specific area. So for example, you might have one that is focused a lot more on a type of merchandising or something like that. So for us, we don't have one centralized BI team, which means we don't have one team to really build the hub. So we selected some teams that are really innovative, that have a lot of content that might be relevant to the hub, and worked with them to start this Looker hub build process. And with that too, we also selected some teams that are at a really critical stage of their development cycle and that they need a new tool. And we wanted them in Looker to really trailblaze with us as well. Once we identified these hub owners, it was a really good time to let them kind of drive the show as well. Experiment in Looker, get best practices, think about what makes the most sense in terms of organizing content here at Wayfair for the Looker tool. And as we were talking more and more about these items when getting started with these projects, we actually took a lot of their experiences, the questions that they asked and content like that, and created a Looker or Looker introductory wiki page where we had this formalized documentation regarding this tool and some of our mindsets on how we set this up. That actually really helped us as well because it established Looker as a more official tool. Because we had this documentation that we can reference all the time again, it brought more visibility to Looker as a tool as well. So moving forward, as we worked more and more with these teams, we actually decided to create a hub council with the team leads from these areas. And this was critical in our success too, because we met biweekly with these people. And they're really the people that are building the models, that are the ones talking to the stakeholders on what are some of the challenges faced, how they're using the tools. And they're really able to bring us a lot of really interesting ways that people are using it, some of the things that we needed to work on or focus more on from the product side of things, and also establish a lot of best practices that we can share with newer teams that we're onboarding into Looker as well. Cool. So now that we have a bit of a strategy, the implementation side, we determined that for implementation, we wanted actually the domain areas or the individual business areas, as mentioned earlier, to own the actual implementation. And that actually came from a lot of different things that we gathered. And the decision was made because these individual business areas also knew their content, knew their stakeholders, knew their use cases a lot better than us. And that is information that we're not going to be able to consume on the product team very fast or very easily. With that, then, what the product team can do for them is provide them the appropriate resources, be it documentation, be it infrastructure support, be it best practices from other teams, be it just communication lines with different teams. And we really became the people to guide these teams throughout their Looker implementation. So as we got started with Looker, we were trying to look through, okay, as a product team, we only have a certain amount of resource and time to create these documentation content to help guide these teams. What do we want to focus on? And if you want to divide that out, it really could be divided out into 3 different sections of pre-live, go-live, and post-live. And because most of our teams were in the pre-live and go-live phase, that is what we focused on in terms of what resources we wanted to provide in the beginning stages. And that is also when we created something called the implementation playbook on our side. And the implementation playbook really is what we believe are all the individual steps for a Looker project implementation, as well as approximate timelines based on just experiences from other folks at Wayfair, as well as experiences from other Looker customers, and just previous implementation of other types of projects in the technology sector. If you take a look at this, the individual phases probably look very familiar to some of you because it really does stem from the basic software development lifecycle as well. So in here, we have scoping and discovery, which is really important in that because we want Looker to be a community tool and use a hub and spoke methodology, we wanted to make sure that whoever is starting to use Looker have an understanding of why they want to use Looker, how Looker is going to satisfy their use cases, and what information they want to put into Looker. That also allows us to basically share with the other teams already in Looker on, hey, here's a new use case. Do you have any stakeholders that match these use cases as well that we can leverage this content for? Or are there any content that you think might be more useful in the hub or be shared between different teams? So scoping and having that documented was really important to us. The next step is the build step. And for this step specifically, we also worked a lot with the Hub Council on, and we were able to take a lot of best practices from them to create something called the Developer Handbook, which I will talk about a little bit later too. We also have a testing phase, and this one is more up in the air because different teams are going to have different success criteria. And depending on what their success criteria are, they might decide to do testing differently. But once they finish testing, we have a productionization timeline where it really is us taking their Git project and configuring it in our productionization environment. And lastly, the most important step, in our opinion, is the onboarding step, which I will actually talk about a little bit later. So for the build step, I do want to go into this in a little bit more detail because we wanted to create documentation for our developers, not only for them to have compiled resources on here is how on the Looker side, you have the tools to develop, what does the IDE look like, things along those lines. But we also wanted to make sure that we establish certain guidelines for how we want to develop here at Wayfair. For example, one thing that we want all of our developers to do is create separate Explorer files and our best practices, our linting process. We put all of that in one document. So whenever we start a new project, we can just send those developers to this document to reference and understand all of those items. We also do have a Slack channel associated with this handbook too, where if people have specific questions for development, they can ask that Slack channel. It's also really good because when developers have questions, occasionally we just link them to one of these pages because it's already answered in the document. And that saves us a lot of time because we don't have to come up with the same answers over and over again. For onboarding, I want to focus on this a little bit more too, because onboarding is actually one of the things that we find most important. As some of you know, Looker has been known to be a difficult tool to onboard for people who've been more used to other BI-related tools. So for us, it was really important that we got our end users to a state where they understood Looker and can use Looker to the best of the capabilities. So with that, we created a onboarding guide of sorts for our developers and some of the analytics teams that are growing Looker for their areas. And that guide has a lot of content on how you should be thinking about onboarding, what training materials are necessary, and how do you support your end users. And you can actually find that in the resource section on this page as well. Cool. So once we created the implementation playbook and have pieces that we can reference for pre-live and go-live questions, we decided to focus more on the post-live support. And what post-live support looked like was we had a lot of measurements, and we had both quantitative and qualitative measurements. What I have listed on this slide are some of the things that we found important on our side to measure to really see how we're doing with Looker as a tool, as well as how we can determine which areas we might want to focus more of our attention on. For qualitative measurements, we have a lot of different methodologies of gathering one-off or mass feedback, but one of the most important ones is still the Looker Hub Council, where the council members that we meet with bi-weekly can tell us what they hear from their stakeholders because they do work with their stakeholders more, and can also let us know if there are more nuanced questions on their side or questions that need more technology support or things along those lines as well. So with both of these measurements, we were actually able to take some of these away as items to not only prioritize, but build more initiatives on or processes on or focus on our roadmap. Which leads to the last part of where are we now? So for Wayfair's Looker, we are currently at 1,450 users and above. And this is growing constantly because we are adding more and more projects as well. And we have 20 projects, which includes one hub model and a lot of different spoke models. Now, some of these spoke models might be larger, and some of these spoke models might connect to a larger spoke. But the division here, we are still adding more and more of these projects as we move forward. Looker actually has the highest NPS out of all of our tools that we're supporting right now. And that's also something that we really like about this tool is that our users actually do enjoy using it as well. But now that we established Looker more as a tool, we are focusing our priorities in some different areas as well. So one is end user success. So while users do like using our tools, there are still areas that they're running into issues with, or there are areas where we can make their workflow much easier or much better. So those are some of the things that we are digging into and looking to make better now. Another thing is product marketing. So 1,400 some users is definitely not to our 12,000 number that we're kind of aiming towards. So how do we advertise a product to have our BI teams prioritize the build for these users more? Another thing is infrastructure scaling. So now that we have more users and more queries running in Looker, how do we more programmatically scale our infrastructure and resources on the back end to make sure that our users are covered for the data that they need? And then lastly is maintenance and optimization. No matter how well you run a tool, occasionally there are issues that are going to pop up. For example, a user's alert might not be working appropriately, or someone's schedule is broken. So we are taking care of those things as well. With that, then, we are growing Looker, and we do want to use Looker as our main tool for maturing our data community. That being said, we do still have other tools in system right now, but Looker is one of our main ones. We also have some lessons learned with Looker on how when we're building and when we don't own the actual roadmaps for these teams that are building, timelines aren't always going to work out the way that we want. But that's something that we're working with each individual team on as well. We are having more conversations with these BI leadership and working with them to establish priorities and set expectations with their stakeholder leadership team as well on when and how we want to build out Looker projects. Another thing is in order to make Looker more and more successful, we need to change some of the data maturity levels for some of our groups as well. So for teams who were previously just consuming dashboards and not really deep diving into their content more, how do we work with those teams to move them towards that exploratory mindset that we want them to get more into? With that, we were also able to take all the things, including our qualitative, quantitative measurements, some of the goals that we have established, and some of our focus shifts, and create our roadmap, which is something that we shared internally with higher level leadership as well to get additional buy-in and to set those priorities that we've been meaning to grow the tool more as well. But yeah. That's pretty much all the content that I have here. We do have a PDF document in the resources section that you can also reference as well for some of the specific implementation steps that we took and some of the recommendations that we also share with our internal teams. Hopefully that's helpful for you as well. And if you have any questions, let me know.
Thank you for your insightful presentation, Rongjie. I definitely appreciate all the processes that you've put in place at Wayfair because it's made my job infinitely easier. So moving on to the Q&A session, as a reminder, ask all of your questions and submit them into the Q&A box. But we do have some, so do you want to start? Okay, 1 second. For the first question, the Hub and Spoke Council seems to have strong similarities to Scrum project management. What else would you point us to for advancing our team's utilization of data and Looker and advancing their digital maturity?
So yeah, the council was actually something that was actually recommended to us too by several different teams. And some of those people, myself included too, have worked in project management. So you're not wrong about some of the initial background for that. And for advancing the team utilization of data and Looker, one thing that I would highly recommend too is on our onboarding guide, we do have a section on power users. Working with the data council or hub council is really important for us to get a lot of the initial feedback, but getting power user feedback is also really helpful for us too. Identifying people who are really strong data users and who are part of these teams, like they're embedded in the actual teams, can get us feedback that are actually usually not surfaced to us in any other way. Also, because these folks are power users, they have a stake in Looker, they are typically more innovative people. They also have more innovative questions, and this process also helps us identify areas where we need to work on more or create more innovative solutions as well for them. So definitely recommend working with power users as well and establishing those points of contacts throughout different teams.
Thank you. There's another one. Could you talk about the challenges with scaling Looker across different teams from an infra perspective?
Yeah, so I mean, infra is going to be, there are several pieces to infrastructure, I guess, if you want to think about it that way. Like, I'm not quite sure which one this one is asking for specifically. For example, when we started out with Looker, we only had 2 nodes set up and eventually had to grow that because of the number of users that we had and how much each node can support. So some of the challenges there initially that we faced was, when do we determine to grow that? Another thing is, for us, we monitor concurrency as well as the slot utilization as well. So these are things that we initially had a harder time on capturing how exactly we want to measure and when exactly we want to grow. And it's still something that we're working on too, to establish at what point in time does it make sense to have that alerting system to grow these more programmatically and things along those lines. So I'm not quite sure if that answers your question specifically, but feel free to let me know if you have follow-ups to that.
Okay. In a federated BI model, what were the challenges around implementing the hub and spoke model?
Yep. So definitely with a federated BI model, like, you don't have the people building your hub initially, right? So getting that started was a really difficult point for us, just because we were leveraging teams that haven't really heard about Looker at that point in time and don't really necessarily always have the incentive to help us build out the hub or content like that. So it was, in the beginning, it was kind of difficult identifying which teams that made more sense, as well as how we can ask them to prioritize this ask as well. But basically what we came to was starting off with content that relate to their area and just seeing how we can actually add that to the hub. And as we got people, or these developers actually, more and more into the Looker development process, and as they had more stake in Looker, with the Hub Council too, they were also driving the direction of our best practices, the direction of our tool in general, how we leverage Looker. As they had more power there too, they were able to contribute more in a lot of ways to the hub and spoke model. And once we established that initial community of folks, adding additional spokes was more of a natural process, because you already have this community to support and this community to really advertise and drive Looker within the company.
What ERP system does your company use?
So I'm not quite sure by what you mean by ERP.
I'm going to let him follow up if he wants to, but until then, I'm just going to go to a different question. Okay. How many developers do you have, and how do you manage them if they're all representing different domains?
Yeah, so we currently have about 100 developers, which is more than we anticipated, actually, for the number of projects that we have. So we typically actually recommend about 3 developers per domain area team. Just because with more and more developers for a hub and spoke model, people are less likely to communicate with each other. You're more likely to make potential mistakes in the system. And there are more likely going to be bugs that you're going to have to reconcile in some way, shape, or form, and you're going to have redundancies. So we try to limit it to about 3 developers per area, and we actually choose one of them to be more of a tech lead for that area. Those tech leads then are basically added to our hub council, where they can discuss too what other projects that they want to potentially collaborate with more, what other content do they want to add into their project, or what content might make more sense in the hub that they can also leverage. So that's how we kind of manage the developers for these smaller teams. Now, for some of the more innovative BI teams, we do have a much larger number of developers for those, just because for some of those teams, they do communicate more within their own teams, and they are also more innovative as a team as well. So like if one person does something, they share with others, and then they can talk about better ways to improve upon that. For those teams, we're happy to have more developers there. And with those two, we have 1 or 2 tech leads that we promote to the Hub Council. And also we talk with those developers at times as well, especially when they come up with something more innovative and fun that we want to share with everyone else here at Wayfair.
Cool. Thank you. What accounting system does your company use? For instance, SAP, Oracle, etc.
Yes. So for that specifically, that's really outside of our domain. We mostly deal with the larger data tools. So we deal with things like Looker. We deal with things like Google Data Studio, at scale, things along those lines. Now, each individual teams that are, for example, supply chain or finance or talent might have their own data tools underneath that for more specific use cases. And those are not necessarily things that my team work with as much.
How did you get people on board with Looker? Did you have to see them? Did you have them see demos? Sorry.
Yes. So yeah, for us, it was actually really interesting because it was really an internal team that got our attention and shared Looker with us. So the initial team that I was talking about, Akhil's team, they got started with Looker. They really liked it. And that was what caught our attention because they're like, we want Looker to be permanent here at Wayfair. How do we make that happen? And when they were having those conversations with us, they demoed it to us and was like, hey, this is how we're using Looker. And this is why we think it's going to be great for everyone else. So once they got our attention, we really used that team specifically to push Looker to a lot of other teams as well. And as more and more teams got excited about Looker, the hype kind of just naturally built up. And with that too, one thing I'm going to say is that leadership buy-in and having leaders who really support the tool is really important because when a leader can go in, especially at the director level, and actually play around with Looker and show their teams just how easy it is to use and how quick they can get an answer, it really empowers a lot of different people too. And they're like, oh, like my director can do this. Me as a data analyst, I should be able to do this all the time too. And like, if this is what they're expecting us to do, like, okay, I have a demo of that now. I know what I'm expected to do. Like, I'll actually be able to do it. So having those leaders to really send out that message and then also like having more innovative folks then play around and share fun things about Looker really got this rolling to a point where like more and more people know about Looker now and are really excited for it.
I also remember you had mentioned that you guys did road shows as well, right? Within the org?
Yes. So that was also something we did. That's true as well. So for example, like the team that I was talking about, Akhil's team, right? They did some really innovative things with Looker as well. So we actually brought them to well, we don't have a centralized BI team. We do occasionally have like BI leadership meetings to just get a feel about what's going on in the different BI areas. We did bring them to one of those meetings and just be like, hey, look, this is a team that's using tools really well. And that got a lot of people thinking, oh, that might be a good tool for our area as well. So like we had some road shows. And for some of the teams who are like, hey, by the way, we don't like our old data tool solutions anymore. We want to look for new tool solutions. We're also like, okay, your use case sound like it might make sense for Looker. Let's bring in a team that's already using Looker and doing really well with it to show you what this tool has to offer. So that's also something we did.
That's awesome. Are you building tooling around Looker utilizing their APIs? For example, rerun schedules programmatically, enable, disable users via APIs?
Yeah. So those are both things that we're doing. The enabling, disabling user one is still something that we're in the middle of. So it's been implemented in our testing environments, but it's not really live right now just because we're still figuring things out with that regarding like scheduling and things along those lines. For just scheduling things more programmatically, putting them into either PDFs, like larger PDFs, we're using API for that as well. So.
Thank you. How does Google Data Studio work with Looker? How do you share insights with clients?
Yeah. So Google's Data Studio and Looker are both tools that we use a lot here at Wayfair. For Looker, what's more important for us is that end users have that backend data model, the data governance, the source of truth, and it is a easy tool for them to drag and drop with that source of truth and create really good visualization on top afterwards if they want to. Now, Data Studio is a tool that they can easily pull anything from our GCP environment and create a visualization on top of. That also means, though, potentially whatever they're creating that dashboard on it may not be a source of truth. It might just be some random team spinning up a SQL query and putting additional dashboards on that. But it is a much more flexible tool for those kind of one-off use cases or use cases where they're unable to put people in Looker yet. Another thing that we kind of consider too is data maturity and also licensing. So Looker as a license tool, we do want to make sure that they are utilizing Looker appropriately and that we are able to grow them as a community, whereas Data Studio, it's out there. If you want to use it, have fun.
Thank you. Who maintains Wayfair documentation and how often is it refreshed?
Yeah, so I mostly maintain the Looker documentation here at Wayfair. We also do give permission to some of the tech leads on the Hub Council as well for small things that they want to tweak either on the developer's handbook or on some of the content pages on like, oh, what channel should you contact this specific team on, things along those lines. But for most of the content, we try to make it as time agnostic as possible. So we don't have to update it as much. But when major processes change, such as we have a new ticketing system for how we handle access or things along those lines, or even like upgrades, for example, that's when it's like Spark, yep, time to update documentation. And as I'm basically creating communication around these items, I just go in and update the documentation as well.
What governance challenges did you have as a federated BI team, and how did Looker help you address them?
Yeah, so with a federated BI team, obviously you come to the point where the same metric might be defined really differently in separate business lines. And those business lines might get confused if one of them sends data to another one and it's this metric and they have a completely different number. With Looker, how that kind of helped us a lot is those teams, as they're adding more content into Looker, we do have a review of their project as well by the Hub Council members to see if there are any redundancies or if there are any things that's not following our best practices. And in that process, we're able to catch to a lot of these where it's like, hey, you have the exact same metric name as this other team, but they're referencing completely different things. Can we potentially define it differently? Or, hey, by the way, you have this metric that's a financial metric where you actually should probably be pulling in from the hub. So whatever source that you were using previously might not be as accurate. And really addressing those issues and communicating with those teams to go through and be more careful, and also reducing those redundancies, which also then helps us like focus on that data governance piece.
Thank you. Last question here. Who did you work with at Looker and at your organization to create these processes?
Yeah. So this process definitely was a combination of a lot of work from a lot of different people. We definitely did contact Heidi a lot in the beginning to see what resources she had for us in terms of people or documentation. And we talked to some other Looker customers, as well as in the beginning when Hub and Spoke was still a very new concept. We talked to Rex, who really started this Hub and Spoke process to help us build out like what made the most sense as we grow, and some of his experiences too. So like all of that was really helpful. Some of the other things that we leveraged too internally was, I actually came from the project management side of things, so leveraging some of the project management mindset as well. And also we talked about just how to implement this with some other internal teams on like either product or engineering to see how they would lay things out to really help us gather like different viewpoints and what made the most sense for this situation.
I do want to plus one that having worked with you and having you as a product manager has been super helpful for me, because you've been very thorough about building these processes and updating the documentations and creating the doc. So definitely appreciate that.
Yeah. I mean, to add to that, like not to toot my
Yeah.
own horn or anything, I do think having product managers in general for these is helpful because while you can have a lot of developers or your BI folks building the tool and modeling it, having someone or a group that's focused on just overall success for the tool, even internally, really helps you take a look at things from like a different perspective and gather those viewpoints to focus on what you want to do in the future.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Rongjie. I don't think we have any more questions, so we can end a little bit early.
Cool. Sounds good.
Yeah, I think that's a wrap. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.